Ambassador Chen Wei sat in the same uncomfortable chair he had occupied for 47 years and tried to remember why humanity had ever wanted this. The Galactic Council chamber stretched above him like a cathedral built for gods who had long ago stopped listening to prayers, and the representatives of 200 species filled the tiered seats that rose in concentric circles toward a domed ceiling that showed the stars beyond. Chen was tired, and the kind of tired that sleep could not fix. The Arkham speaker stood at the center podium, and its crystalline body refracted the chamber's light into cold rainbows as it spoke in the harmonic frequencies that the translation devices rendered into words. The human expansion into the 30th sector constitutes a violation of Council Resolution 7743 and demonstrates the continued aggressive tendencies of this dangerous species. Chen wanted to laugh, but he had learned long ago that showing emotion in this chamber only made things worse. The 3 mining colonies humanity had established were in unclaimed space. Every survey had confirmed this, and the resources extracted there were desperately needed for the growing population of the outer colonies. But facts did not matter here. What mattered was that humanity was young and brash and needed to be taught there. Place. Chen remembered the first time he had walked into this chamber, and he had been so much younger then and filled with hope that felt now like a cruel joke. First contact had happened 73 years ago when the Valorum survey ship had detected Earth's radio signals and deemed humanity ready for introduction to galactic civilization. The world had celebrated, and Chen had been a university student then watching the broadcasts with tears streaming down his face as he imagined all the wonders that awaited. The reality had been somewhat different. Within a year of joining the Council, humanity had learned the rules, and there were so many rules. Human ships could only travel at certain speeds, and human colonies could only be established in certain regions, and human technology could only be developed along certain approved pathways. The weapons restrictions had come first, and humanity could maintain no more than 300 military vessels, and each one had to be registered and inspected annually by Council peacekeepers. Then came the territorial limits, and humanity was confined to a sphere roughly 30 light-years in radius centered on Earth, while species like the Archons controlled thousands of systems. The technology-sharing agreements had followed, and humanity was required to provide all scientific discoveries to the Council database, while access to advanced Council technology required lengthy applications and substantial fees. The integration fees themselves were crippling, and humanity paid billions of credits annually for the privilege of Council membership while receiving almost nothing in return. But humanity had accepted all of it. They had believed that patience and cooperation would eventually lead to equality, and that if they proved themselves peaceful and responsible, the restrictions would. Yishen had believed it too. He had spent his entire adult life in service to that belief and working his way up through the diplomatic corps until he became humanity's chief ambassador to the Council. 47 years of sitting in this chamber and watching his people be dismissed and diminished and treated like children who could not be trusted with sharp objects. The Archon speaker continued its denunciation and calling for penalties and restrictions, and Chen knew how this would end. The vote would be near unanimous, and the few species who might have sympathy for humanity would remain silent rather than risk Council displeasure. The penalties would be announced, and humanity would be ordered to abandon the 30th colonies and pay another fine and accept more restrictions, and humanity would comply. They always complied. Chen thought about the people living in those 3 colonies, and miners and engineers and scientists who had broken no laws and violated no legitimate territorial claims. He thought about the resources those colonies produced and rare earth elements and isotopes that powered the fusion reactors keeping the outer colonies alive. Thought about what compliance meant and how many opportunities lost and how many dreams deferred. The vote came as expected, and 197 species voted to penalize humanity, and 2 abstained, and 1 voted against. The lone dissenting vote came from the Kythera and a small species who had themselves been victims of council overreach in centuries past. The Archon speaker announced the penalties with what Chun had learned to recognize as satisfaction in its harmonic voice. Humanity would abandon the Tertius colonies within 60 standard days and pay a fine of 15 billion credits and submit to enhanced oversight of all future expansion plans. But there was more. The speaker raised 1 crystalline appendage and the chamber fell silent. The Council has also approved new safety protocols to ensure compliance with galactic law, and all human vessels will now be subject to random inspection and search by Council peacekeepers, and these inspections may occur at any time and in any location, and failure to comply will result in immediate seizure of the vessel in question. Chung felt something cold settle in his chest. This went beyond the usual harassment, and this was giving Council peacekeepers the power to stop and search any human ship anywhere. For any reason, he thought about the merchant vessels that carried food and medicine between the colonies and the transport ships that moved families and supplies, and the small private craft that represented what little freedom humanity had left in the vast distances of space. All of them now subject to random searches by peacekeepers who had never shown humanity anything. But Contemption activated his podium's communication array and requested permission to speak, and knowing it would be denied. But having to try, the Archon speaker did not even acknowledge the request. Around the chamber, other representatives were already moving on to the next item of business, and something about trade route allocations that did not involve humanity. Chun sat back in his uncomfortable chair and felt the weight of 47 years pressing down on him. He had given his entire life to making this work and to building bridges and finding common ground and proving that humanity deserved a place among the stars. And it had not mattered. Nothing he had done had mattered. The Council did not want humanity as equals, and they wanted humanity as subjects, and as a cautionary tale, and as proof that the ancient species knew best. Chun looked up at the dome showing the stars and wondered how many human ships were out there right now and sailing between worlds and carrying people who trusted that their government would protect them. And he wondered what would happen when the peacekeepers started boarding those ships. He wondered when patience stopped being a virtue and became cowardice. The session ended and Chun gathered his materials and walked out of the chamber for what he did not yet know would be one of the last times. Behind him, the Archon speaker's crystalline body caught the light and throwing rainbow shadows across empty seats. The Council had spoken, and humanity would comply. They always did, at least they had until now. The inspections began within a week, and the Council peacekeepers were mostly Archons, and they approached their new authority with enthusiasm that bordered on zealotry. Captain Sarah Okonkwo was 3 days out from Mars when the peacekeepers hailed her ship, and she commanded a medium transport called the Memphis Star, and her cargo hold was full of medical supplies bound for New Kyoto. The colony world had 17,000 inhabitants, and most of them were families who had come seeking new opportunities among the stars, and their primary exports were agricultural products grown in the rich volcanic soil. But there had been an outbreak and a viral mutation that the local medical facilities were not equipped to handle, and the Memphis Star carried vaccines and antivirals and treatment equipment that would stop the spread before it became catastrophic. Sarah had made this run dozens of times, and she knew the route like she knew her own heartbeat, and 14 days of steady acceleration and coasting and deceleration that would put her in New Kyoto orbit with time to spare. The Archon peacekeeper ship appeared on her sensors like a bad omen, and massive and bristling with weapons that dwarfed her transports. Minimal defensive arrays. Human vessel Memphis Star, you are ordered to cut engines and prepare for inspection. The translated voice crackled over her communications array. Sarah exchanged looks with her first officer and Marcus Chen, who was coincidentally the nephew of the ambassador. though she had earned her position through skill, not connections. Peacekeeper vessel, this is Memphis Star, and we are carrying time-sensitive medical cargo to an outbreak zone, and we request expedited inspection or clearance to proceed with post-delivery. Inspection upon return. The response came back flat and without room for negotiation. Request denied and cut engines immediately, or we will interpret your movement as an attempt to flee lawful authority. Sarah cut the engines. The inspection took 11 days. The Archon peacekeepers went through every container and every storage locker and every personal belonging of her crew, and they demanded documentation for cargo that was clearly labeled, and they questioned Sarah's crew individually and repeatedly about their destinations and purposes and loyalties. Sarah tried everything, and she filed formal complaints, and she contacted the Council Oversight Committee, and she even managed to get a message through to Ambassador Chun. Nothing worked. The peacekeepers seemed to be following the letter of the new regulations while ignoring their spirit, and they were entitled to conduct thorough inspections, and there was no defined time limit, and human protests were noted and dismissed on the 9th day. Sarah received a priority message from New Kyoto, and the outbreak had spread, and the colony's chief medical officer was rationing their remaining supplies and projecting that without the Memphis Star's cargo, they would lose between 2,000 and 3,000 people, mostly children whose immune systems could not fight off the virus. Sarah played that message for the Archon inspector and practically begged them to expedite the inspection. The inspector's crystalline face was unreadable, as always, and its translated response was matter-of-fact. Your emotional appeals are noted, and this inspection will be completed according to proper protocols, and perhaps in the future, human vessels will maintain better compliance records and thereby avoid such delays. Sarah wanted to scream that they had perfect compliance records and that every piece of documentation was in order and that people were dying, but she had learned that showing emotion to Archons only made them slower on. The 11th day, the inspection was declared complete and no violations had been found, and the Memphis Star was cleared to proceed. Sarah pushed her engines beyond recommended limits, and trying to make up lost time, she arrived at New Kyoto 6 days later than scheduled. The colony had lost 3,147 people. Most of them were children. Sarah stood on the bridge and watched the colony lights through the view screen, and so many lights that would never burn again, and she wept. The colony governor held a memorial service, and Sarah attended along with her crew, and they stood among thousands of grieving parents and siblings and friends. Names were read aloud, and all 3,147. And it took hours. Sarah would remember those names for the rest of her life, and especially the children and Majo age 7 and James Okafor age 5 and twins named Sarah and Samuel Kowalski age 9 and on until the names blurred together into a litany of loss. Ambassador Chun filed a formal complaint with the Council and presenting evidence of the peacekeeper delay and the outbreak timeline and the deaths that could have been prevented. He demanded accountability and an investigation and consequences for the Archons who had prioritized bureaucratic thoroughness over human lives. The Council heard his presentation. They did not watch the evidence files. The Velorum speaker's response was brief and delivered with the kind of condescension that made Chun's hand shake. The Council acknowledges the tragic loss of life on the human colony, and however, the peacekeepers in question were operating within established protocols, and young species must learn that actions have consequences. And perhaps if humanity had maintained better disease prevention measures, this tragedy could have been avoided. The implication was clear, and this was humanity's fault. Chan sat in his chair and looked around the chamber at 200 species who would not meet his eyes, and who found the dong suddenly fascinating, and who checked their data tablets with great interest. Not one of them spoke in humanity's defense. Not one of them suggested that maybe, and just maybe, in killing 3,000 people to prove a point about proper procedures was wrong. Chan stood, and he did not ask for permission to speak, and he simply activated his podium array and let his voice echo through the chamber. I have served in this chamber for 47 years, and I have watched humanity comply with every demand and every restriction and every humiliation you have imposed. And we accepted weapons limits that left us vulnerable, and we accepted territorial restrictions that stifled our growth, and we paid your fees and shared our technology and bent ourselves into shapes that fit your comfort. His voice was shaking now, and decades of suppressed anger finally breaking through. We did all of this because we believed in the promise of the Council, and we believed that patience and cooperation would lead to partnership, and that you would eventually see us as equals. He looked up at the Archon speaker. You killed 3,000 of my people to teach us a lesson, and children who never broke your laws and never threatened your precious order, and whose only crime was being born human. The chamber was silent. I resign my position effective immediately, and humanity will be withdrawing from the Galactic Council, and all treaties are void and all agreements are terminated. And we tried your way, and we bent, and we compromised, and we buried our dead, and called it diplomacy. Chen's voice dropped to something cold and hard. No more. He walked out of the chamber, and behind him chaos erupted as representatives shouted questions and demanded explanations and tried to process what had just happened. No species had ever voluntarily left a council, not in 10,000 years. Chen did not look back. He had spent 47 years looking back and wondering if he had done enough and said the right things and made the necessary compromises. He was done looking back. The news spread across human space within hours, and on Earth and Mars and the outer colonies and in the deep space stations. And aboard the ships sailing between stars, Ambassador Chen had resigned. Humanity was leaving the council, and for the first time in decades the response was not fear or uncertainty. It was relief, and something else. Something that tasted like anger. Finally allowed to breathe on New Kyoto. They were still burying the dead, and still reading names, and still trying to explain to siblings and friends why their loved ones were gone. The news reached them as they laid the last small body to rest. Captain Sarah Okonkwo stood at the grave of Mei Jo, an age 7, who had loved drawing pictures of the stars, and she received the message on her communication. Implant humanity was done bending. Sarah looked up at the sky, and somewhere up there the council was probably panicking and trying to figure out what humanity's withdrawal meant. She hoped they were scared. She hoped they understood what they had done. But mostly she hoped they remembered the names, all 3,147. The formal withdrawal took 30 days to process, and 30 days of humanity systematically dismantling every connection to the Galactic Council. Chen Wei was no longer an ambassador, but the governments of Earth and Mars and the outer colonies had immediately appointed him as Secretary of External Relations and a position with broader authority and fewer restrictions. His first act was to recall every human scientist working on Council projects. Dr. Amara Ase had spent 15 years at the Council's central research facility on Valorum Prime and working on exotic matter applications alongside researchers from 40 different species, and she had poured her life into that work and believing she was contributing to something greater than any one species. The recall order came through on a Tuesday morning. She read it 3 times and not quite believing what it said, and then she looked around the laboratory at her colleagues and the Valorum energy being who supervised their team, and the insectoid Kithara, who had become something like a friend, and the Archon, whose crystalline structure allowed it to perceive dimensions Amara could barely conceptualize. They were all staring at their own communication devices. The Valorum supervisor approached her, and its gaseous form shifting colors and patterns she had learned to read as concern. Dr. Ase, this is unexpected, and is there some mistake? Amara shook her head, and trying to process the emotions swirling through her. No. Mistaken humanity is withdrawing from the council, and all personnel are being recalled. She had not cried when she read about New Kyoto. and she had locked that grief away in a place where she could function and could continue her work and could pretend that everything would eventually be okay. But now standing in this laboratory where she had spent 15 years of her life, and the tears came. "I am sorry," she said to the Valorum and to the Kithara and to all of them. "I am so sorry, but I cannot stay here while my people's children are being killed, and while we are treated like dangers instead of partners." She left that afternoon across Council space. Similar scenes played out, and human engineers recalled from shipyards, and human medical staff recalled from hospitals, and human teachers recalled from cultural exchange programs. Every human who had believed in the promise of cooperation and who had worked to build bridges between species and who had tried to prove that humanity deserved their place among the stars, all of them coming home. The technology recalls came next. Human corporations had entered joint ventures with council companies and sharing innovations in everything from fusion reactor design to quantum computing to genetic therapies. Those partnerships were dissolved overnight. The Archon Technology Consortium had been using human-developed neural interface protocols for 30 years and incorporating them into their systems and selling them across Council space. On day 15 of the withdrawal, humanity revoked all licensing agreements. Protocols were human intellectual property and developed by human researchers, and they were no longer available to the Council. The Consortium filed a protest and claiming that 30 years of integration made the technology essential infrastructure. Chen's response was brief, and he remembered the 3,147 names. "You should have thought of that before." The economic impact rippled across Council space, and joint ventures collapsing, and supply chains disrupted, and technologies suddenly unavailable. The Council had not realized how deeply integrated human innovation had become in their civilization. They had thought of humanity as recipients of Council wisdom and never questioning how much they had come to rely on human creativity and human determination and human solutions to problems. The ancient species had stopped trying to solve the fortification of human space began immediately. Admiral Kwame Okonkwo stood on the bridge of the USCS Defiant and watching construction drones swarm around the new defensive platforms being built at the edge of human territory. He was Sarah's father and the captain who had watched children die because of Council bureaucracy, and the rage he felt was cold and focused and useful. The weapons restrictions had limited humanity to 300 military vessels. Those restrictions no longer applied every shipyard in human space had retooled, and civilian transports could wait, and colony ships could wait and write. Now humanity needed teeth. Mining operations in the 30th sector and the colonies the Council had demanded be abandoned and tripled their output. The workers there knew they were the flashpoint and the excuse the Council had used, and they were not evacuating. Instead, they were digging in ore and rare elements and isotopes and everything needed to build ships and weapons and defensive platforms flowed back toward Earth and Mars and the construction hubs in the outer colonies. Humanity had spent decades building a peaceful spacefaring civilization. It took them less than 2 months to remember how to build for war. On day 28, a Council delegation arrived at Earth 5, ships and small and unarmed, and displaying diplomatic immunity codes. They were met in orbit by Admiral Okonkwo on the Defiant and flanked by 2 destroyer escorts. The Valorum delegation leader requested permission to land and to open negotiations and to find some path back from the brink. Okonkwo's response was calm and professional and absolutely final. Human space is now close to Council vessels, and you are ordered to depart immediately. And this is your only warning. The Valorum tried again, and speaking of centuries of cooperation and shared interests and the catastrophe the war would bring, Okonkwo cut the transmission and activated his weapons arrays, not targeting the delegation ships but lighting them up on sensors and making it clear what would happen if they did not leave. "You have 30 minutes to be beyond our border," he said, and his voice hard as steel. "After that, you will be escorted out by force and choose." The delegation left in 28 minutes on Council Prime. The leaders of 200 species gathered in emergency session. The Archons were outraged and calling the human withdrawal an act of aggression and demanding military response to Valorum. Were more cautious and pulling ancient archives and studying humanity's history in ways they had never bothered to do before. What they found disturbed them. Humanity had achieved spaceflight less than 2 centuries ago, and before that they had been confined to one world, and one world where they had nearly destroyed themselves in wars that made council conflicts look like minor disagreements. Nuclear weapons and chemical weapons and biological weapons and conflicts that killed millions, but they had stopped, and somehow these violent and fractious and dangerous humans have looked at their own capacity for destruction and chosen differently. They had unified, and not perfectly, and never completely, and but enough to reach for the stars instead of burning their own world. Enough to build cities on Mars and stations in deep space and colonies on distant worlds. Enough to create art and music and literature that spoke of hope and wonder and dreams of better tomorrows. The Valorum shared this information with the Council. These humans fought a global war that nearly ended their species. The Valorum Elder stated, and its colors shifting in patterns that indicated deep concern. They developed weapons that could destroy their entire world, and then they chose to put those weapons away and reach for space instead. The Elder's next words fell like stones in still water, and now we have pushed them back toward what they were, and toward what they chose to leave behind, and we have reminded them how to be dangerous. The Archon speaker dismissed this. They are children playing at being warriors, and we have maintained peace in this galaxy for 10,000 years, and they will learn their place. The Valorum Elders. Colors shifted to something that looked like pity. No, it said quietly, "We will learn ours on Earth and Chun." Wei sat in his new office and overlooking the sprawl of Geneva below, and he felt the weight of what was coming. He had started this, and his resignation and his anger and his refusal to bend any more humanity had followed him, and trusting that withdrawal was better than submission. Now he had to see it through. His communication array chimed, and Admiral Okonkwo's face appeared on the screen. "Sir, and we have reports of Council fleet movements, and they are massing ships at the border." Chun nodded, and he had known this was coming. "How many ships can we field if they cross?" Okonkwo smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. 700 and counting, and sir, and every shipyard is running triple shifts, and we will have more by the end of the week. 700 ships. The Council thought humanity was limited to 300. They were about to learn their first lesson about what happened when you pushed humanity too far. Chun looked out at the city below, and thinking about all the cities like it across human space, and all the colonies, and all the people who were counting on him to keep them safe. "Maintain defensive positions," he ordered. "An admiral, and when they come, and they will come and show them what we are." Okonkwo saluted, and the transmission ended. Chun turned back to the window and watched the sun set over Earth. Somewhere out there the Council was preparing to teach humanity a lesson. He hoped they were ready to be students instead. The Council fleet numbered 300 ships, and it was an armada designed to intimidate and to demonstrate overwhelming force and to remind humanity of their place. The Archon warship Eternal Radiance led the formation, and a crystalline Leviathan, 3 kilometers long and bristling with weapons that had ended rebellions and crushed pirate fleets and enforced Council law for centuries. Supreme Commander Dexkaran stood at the center of the Eternal Radiance's command nexus, and its crystalline body pulsing with confidence. The Council had voted for military action after humanity ignored their demands to return to the fold, and the vote had been close, but the Archons had argued persuasively. humanity needed to learn and needed to understand. That leaving the Council was not an option and needed to be reminded that they were young and weak and dependent on Council mercy. Dex Karen believed this absolutely. The fleet had intelligence on human military capabilities and 300 registered vessels and limited weapons technology and defensive platforms that were adequate for pirates. But nothing more. The Council fleet would sweep through human space and disable the defensive platforms and force the surrender of the military vessels, and occupy Earth until humanity agreed to return under even stricter terms. It would be over in days and maybe weeks at most. Fleet crossed into human space at the Proxima Gate, and a major transit point between Council territory and the human sphere. Thanks Karen expected to find a small defensive force and maybe 30 or 40 ships, and probably already preparing to surrender instead. The sensors lit up with contacts, 200 ships, and then 300, and then 500, and the numbers kept climbing. 700 human vessels held position around Proxima Gate. X Karen felt something unfamiliar, and something that took it a moment to recognize as doubt. The human ships were not the sleek explorers and civilian transports the Council databases showed, and these were purpose-built warships and angular and armored and studded with weapons. Array's Admiral Okonkwo stood on the bridge of the Defiant and watched the Council fleet emerge from their jump, and his expression was calm. He had spent 2 months preparing for this moment, and 2 months of rushed construction and strategic planning and making sure that when the Council came, they would find humanity ready. His tactical officer called out contacts and identifying ship classes and threat assessments. Sir, we have positive identification on the Eternal Radiance and Archon command ship, and it is the largest vessel in their fleet. Okonkwo nodded and studying the tactical display. 700 human ships against 300 Council vessels. The numbers favored humanity, but numbers were not everything, and the Council had more advanced technology and more experience and ships that had fought battles when humans were still figuring out agriculture, but the Council had never fought humans. Open a channel, Okonkwo ordered. The Diaz communication array activated and broadcasting to the entire Council fleet, Council vessels, and this is Admiral Kwame Okonkwo of the United Sovereign Colonies, and you had entered human space without authorization, and you are ordered to withdraw immediately. The response came from Dex Karen, and its translated voice carrying the harmonics of condescension. Human commander, and your withdrawal from the Council is illegal, and your military buildup is a violation of established treaties, and you will stand down and surrender your vessels and accept Council authority. Okonkwo smiled, but there was no warmth in it. The treaties you cite were voided when you killed 3,147 of my people, and children and civilians and people who had done nothing wrong except be born human. He leaned forward and his voice hardening. You will withdraw and or we will remove you by force, and you have 5 minutes to decide. Dex Karen did not need 5 minutes. All ships attack Formation Delta and disable their command vessels and minimize casualties where possible. The Council fleet advanced. The Battle of Proxima Gate began with the Council's confidence and ended with their education. The human ships did not fight the way the Council expected. There was no orderly exchange of fire at range, and no attempts to disable rather than destroy, and no adherence to the established rules of civilized warfare. Instead, the human swarm squadrons of smaller ships surrounded larger Council vessels and their weapons, coordinating in patterns that overwhelmed defensive shields, and dozens of impacts, hitting simultaneously and finding weak points that should not have been known. The Council databases on human weapons technology were years out of date. Humanity had been developing new systems in secret and not sharing with the Council, and now those weapons revealed themselves kinetic railguns that fired projectiles at relativistic speeds and impossible to intercept, and punching through shields and armor like tissue paper, directed energy weapons that focused on the same point from multiple ships and creating combined beams that could cut through a cruiser's hull in seconds, and drones. Thousands of autonomous drones that launched from the human ships. Like swarms of mechanical insects, the drones were cheap and fast and equipped with just enough intelligence to identify targets, and just enough explosive power to cripple systems. They threw themselves at Council ships in waves and trading volume for precision, and the Council's sophisticated point defense systems could not stop them all for every 10 drones destroyed. And 2 or 3 got through, and 2 or 3 was enough. The Archon cruiser, Divine Purpose, lost its main engines to a drone swarm, and then its communications, and then its weapons, and within minutes it was drifting. Helpless, the Valorum destroyer, Harmonic Resonance, tried to withdraw after its shields failed, but human fighters harried it at every turn, and forcing it to surrender or be destroyed. Thix Karen watched from the eternal radiance as its fleet was systematically dismantled. This was not how battles were supposed to go. The Council had rules and conventions and thousands of years of established military doctrine. The humans were ignoring all of it. A squadron of human destroyers focused fire on the eternal radiance's shield emitters and the combined kinetic and energy weapons, overloading the generators faster than they could compensate. F's Karen ordered evasive maneuvers, but the massive warship was built for power, not agility. Humans had planned for this. As the eternal radiance's shields flickered, a wave of drones struck its communication arrays and targeting sensors and propulsion systems, not destroying the ship but crippling it and turning the mighty flagship into a massive floating monument to Archon. Hubris. Thix Karen's last order before the communication systems failed completely was a general retreat. What remained of the Council fleet tried to withdraw as 23 ships made it out. The rest were captured or destroyed or drifting in space. Waiting for human salvage crews, the humans did not pursue beyond the border. They held position around Proxima, Jade, and their weapons still active and their message clear. This far and no farther, Admiral. Okonkwo walked through the captured Eternal Radiance. 3 days after the battle, the Archon crew had surrendered peacefully once their ship was disabled, and they had been treated in accordance with human laws regarding prisoners and given medical care and adequate quarters, and treated with dignity, more dignity than they had shown humanity. Thix Karen sat in a converted cargo bay that served as the senior officer's detention area, and its crystalline body had dulled without access to the energy systems that normally kept it vibrant. "You have made a terrible mistake," it said as Okonkwo approached. "The Council will never accept this defeat, and they will send more ships and larger fleets, and they will not stop until humanity is subjugated." Okonkwo studied the former Supreme Commander, and feeling something like pity, "You still do not understand," he said quietly. "We are not trying to conquer the Council, and we do not want your territory or your resources, and we just want to be left alone." He turned to leave and then paused. "You killed children to prove a point about paperwork, and you thought we would accept that and bow our heads and ask forgiveness for inconveniencing you." Okonkwo looked back at Thix Karen. "We are done bowing, and the next fleet you send will face twice as many ships as this one did, and the one after that even more. And we will keep building until you understand that we are not subjects, and we are not children, and we are not going to bend anymore." He left the Archon commander sitting in the cargo bay and left it to contemplate what its arrogance had cost. The news of the battle reached Council Prime within hours. The further it contemplated what its arrogance had cost her, the news of the battle reached Council Prime within hours. The Verdier emergency session was chaos. The Archons demanded full mobilization and total war, and the commitment of every military asset the Council possessed. The Valorum countered with the data from the battle, and analyzing human tactics and capabilities, and projecting the cost of continued conflict. They fielded 700 ships when our intelligence said they had 300. The Valorum elder stated. They deployed weapon systems we had no knowledge of and tactics we were unprepared for, and they defeated a fleet that has enforced council law for centuries. The Elder's colors shifted to something that might have been fear, and this was after only 2 months of unrestricted preparation. And what will they be capable of after a year and after 10 years? And if we push them into total war? The Archon speaker refused to accept this. 6 months after the Battle of Proxima Gate, the galaxy had changed in ways that would never be reversed. Chen Wei stood at the window of his office and watching ships come and go from the orbital platforms above Earth, and some were human, and some were not. The Kithara had been first. The small insectoid species had suffered under Archon dominance for centuries, and their home systems, stripped of resources, and their people treated as second-class members of the Council, and their complaints dismissed with the same condescension humanity had experienced. 3 weeks after Proxima Gate, a Kithara delegation arrived at human space, and they came unarmed and transmitted their intentions clearly. They wanted a mutual defense pact. Chan had met with them personally, and sitting across from Ambassador Zikthara, and a Kithara whose carapace bore scars from what Chun recognized as punishment markings, and the kind the Archons inflicted on species who questioned their authority. We watched you fight, Zikthara said, and its translated voice carrying harmonics of hope. We watched you win, and we watched you say no. And we want to say no too, but we cannot do it alone. The pact was signed within a week. The Kithara were followed by the Norian and an aquatic species whose ocean worlds had been designated as Council Nature Preserves, and with their people restricted to a fraction of their own planet's surface. Then came the Turthan and a reptilian species whose military had been forcibly disbanded after they had defended their territory against Archon expansion, and their defense labeled as aggression. Then others in species Chun had never heard of, and species who had been council members for thousands of years, but whose voices had never mattered. All of them came to human space, and all of them wanted the same thing. They wanted to stand up. Council was fracturing, and the ancient species who had maintained power for millennia were watching their empire crack along fault lines they had ignored for too long. The Archons still called for war and still demanded humanity be brought to heel. But now when they called votes for military action, and dozens of species abstained or voted against, the balance of power was shifting, and slowly and inevitably, and like a massive ship changing course. The Valorum Elder had been sending messages to Chun for months, and each one more urgent than the last, and each one warning that the hardliners were growing desperate. Finally, the Elder requested a face-to-face meeting. Chun agreed, but not on Council Prime, and not on Earth-neutral territory, and a small station at the edge of both human and Council space, and surrounded by ships from both sides. Chun arrived on a diplomatic shuttle and accompanied by Admiral Okonkwo and former Ambassador Sarah. Okonkwo, who had been promoted to Secretary of Colonial Affairs after New Kyoto. The memorial service there had lasted 3 days, and they had built a monument with 3,147 names carved into black stone. Sarah had attended the dedication, and she still carried the weight of those names. The Valorum Elder met them in a conference chamber designed to accommodate its gaseous form and its colors. Shifting in patterns, Chun had learned meant greeting and respect. Secretary Chun, and I am grateful you agreed to meet. Chun nodded, and taking his seat. You said you had a proposal, and the council has 6 months to make it, and we are listening. The Elder's colors swirled in forming patterns that looked like sorrow. First, I must offer what your people would call an apology, and the council wronged humanity, and we wronged you in ways that cannot be easily repaired, and 3,147 children died because we valued bureaucracy over compassion and order over justice. The Elder paused, and its form contracting and expanding. No apology can return them, but they deserve to be acknowledged. Sarah's hands tightened. on the armrests of her chair, but she said nothing. Chun waited. "The council is broken," the elder continued. "It has been broken for centuries, and perhaps for millennia, and we became so focused on maintaining our power and our systems and our authority that we forgot why we built the council in the first place." The colors shifted to something that looked like determination. "Some of us wish to rebuild and to create something better and to make the council what it should be, and a place where all species have equal voice and equal protection and equal opportunity." Admiral Okonkwo leaned forward, and the Archons, the elders' colors flickered, "are divided, and some support reformation and most resisted, but they are no longer the majority. They once were, and your victory at Proxima Gate and the alliance forming around humanity and have shifted the political landscape." Chum studied the Valorum and trying to read intentions in the swirling colors. "What exactly are you proposing?" The elder expanded and filling the chamber with its presence. "A reformation of the Galactic Council and complete restructuring and rotating leadership. Selected by vote and not by tradition, and equal representation for all member species, regardless of age or power, and mutual defense pacts without hegemony, and most importantly, and protection against the abuses that harmed humanity." The elder continued, and its voice taking on urgency. "We would dissolve the current council authority and rebuild from principles of equality and sovereignty and mutual benefit, and no species would be subject to another, and no species would be restricted based on fear rather than evidence." Sarah spoke for the first time. "And what about reparations? And what about accountability for New Kyoto?" The elder's colors shifted to patterns. Chun could not quite read. "We propose full financial reparations to the families of those lost. And we propose that the Archon peacekeepers responsible for the delay face trial under a new justice system with human participation. And we propose a memorial funded by council resources. And we propose that the protocols that caused this tragedy be permanently banned." Chun exchanged looks with Okonkwo and with Sarah. "We need to discuss this with our government," he said. "And we need to bring this to the people and to the colonies and to those who lost loved ones, and they deserve to have a voice in what happens next." The elder's colors pulsed agreement. "Of course, and take the time you need. But I must tell you that the window for peaceful reformation is closing, and the hardliners grow stronger every day. And if we do not act soon, the only path forward may be war." The meeting ended, and Chun, his team returned to their shuttle on the flight back to Earth. They were silent, and each processing what they had heard. Finally, Sarah spoke. "Do you trust them?" Chun looked out at the stars. "I trust that they are scared, and I trust that they see the alternative, and I trust that some of them genuinely want change." He turned to face her. "But I also remembered that they watched 3,000 children die and did nothing, and so no. And I do not fully trust them, and not yet, and maybe not ever." Admiral Okonkwo nodded slowly. "But we might work with them anyway." Chun considered this. "We might, but only on our terms, and only with protections, and only if we maintain the strength to defend ourselves if they betray us." The proposal went before the human governments, and the debate lasted weeks. Some argued for complete isolation and for building a human sphere separate from the council and for never trusting the species who had wronged them. Others argued that reformation was worth trying and that a truly equal council could prevent future atrocities, and that cooperation was better than eternal conflict. Families of New Kyoto held their own vote. It was close, but they chose to support negotiations on the condition that the names were never forgotten. Chun carried that decision back to the elder. "Humanity will participate in reformation negotiations, but we have conditions." He laid them out one by one. Full reparations to every family affected by New Kyoto, and not just financial, but medical support and educational opportunities and housing assistance, trials for the Archon peacekeepers, responsible, and under a new judicial system with representatives from multiple species. including humans a permanent seat for humanity on any reformed council security apparatus, and with veto power over peacekeeping operations, constitutional protections against the restrictions that have been imposed on humanity, and no species could be limited based on age or perceived danger without clear evidence and due process. The elder agreed to all of it. Negotiations took 3 months, and they were contentious and filled with walkouts and arguments and moments when it seemed the whole thing would collapse, but slowly and painfully, and a new structure emerged. The reformed Galactic Council would have rotating leadership and elected every 5 years by vote of all member species. Each species would have equal representation, regardless of size or age or power. Military forces would be restructured as a mutual defense coalition and not a peacekeeping force, and with strict limitations on when and how they could be deployed. A new judicial system would handle disputes with judges drawn from multiple species and with protections against the kind of bureaucratic cruelty that had killed the children of New Kyoto, and humanity would have a permanent position on the Security Council and with the power to prevent the abuses they had suffered. The old council formally dissolved on a gray morning 6 months after the Battle of Proxima. Gate-chun stood in the same chamber where he had served for 47 years and where he had watched his people be diminished, and where he had finally said no. The Archon speaker was not present, and it had refused to participate, and along with several other hardline Archons who retreated to their home.